does a company navigate the challenge of maturity and yet hang on to its entrepreneurial spirit? And how does that affect its supply chain? That is the topic of my conversation today with Alex Pierroutsakos. He is Vice President of Supply Chain and Analytics with Stellium Inc. Hello, Alex.
How are you doing?
This is a fascinating question, and of course it's an age-old question, and many companies fail the test from day one because of their institutional behavior. So help me to understand how a company can undergo natural maturity, natural growth, and yet hang on to some of that quality that made it an exciting startup where people were effective and efficient without being weighed down by bureaucratic ineptitude.
Starting first, you have to look at how do companies and what are companies here for. Intrinsic value is about growth, but doing it profitably. So as you look at a company and as it matures, its number one focus in the beginning is growth. Finding new companies, finding customers, and then you hit a point where the systems that got you there can no longer work. So now you have to look at systems and processes that will help you manage that complexity. That's where the ultimate inflection point is for many companies. How do you enable that? The sales force, the entrepreneurial spirit, the control that you had at one point that got you to where you are, but at the same time give you the scale and the ability to grow. And that's about systems and processes and having the information to be able to build those processes, but at the same time have it in balance. You gotta find that, you gotta strike that right balance. And that's about having flexibility in what you can provide to a cross-functional organization. So let's talk about that. So I'm going to specifically talk about example, S&OP. So one of the biggest drivers—
Sales and operations
Sales
planning.
and operational planning, absolutely. That's where your innovation, your sales, the revenue part of the company meets the operations, efficiency, managing operational costs. The two things that must be in sync for you to have an intrinsic value creation or to grow value in a company, which is ultimately what you need to do for shareholder value. So in this example, you have to build a cross-functional system and process that's light, that enables to get information, specifically forecast accuracy. We all know the trouble that sales has when it needs to provide forecast accuracy so we can ensure that product is at the customer at the right level. The question is, what is profitable? How do we manage? Salesforce is always going to want 100% product availability. At the same time, you have operations that's wanting to be able to have it as lean and mean as possible. So that's where you have to have a strong system, a light system that's not going to weigh heavily, that's not going to create a lot of work to keep the sales force very focused on doing what it's supposed to be doing, at the same time providing information for the operations part of the business.
But size itself frustrates that effort. It must, because suddenly you have more people in the organization, you have a more complex reporting structure, you have people burrowing into their own little fiefdoms as a result of that. And so you've got to encounter that, and you've got to deal with that somehow. So how do you deal with just the sheer extra number of people and positions and reporting structures within a company?
Very difficult. I'm not going to say there's an easy answer to that, but the challenge is how can you build a performance management system that allows cross-functional accountability from an organizational perspective. So sales needs to be responsible for profitability as well as growth. Operations needs to be responsible for customer service as well as managing inventory. So people will not change unless they're measured and they have an understanding of how they're being measured. Okay? Then you need to have the systems in place and the processes in place that are flexible, structured, but not overburdening where it creates inefficiency in just the process being managed. Okay, so many times I've seen where people they swing from having no processes to becoming so rigid that it swings the other direction. So the key is you have to have a good performance management process, and let's talk about what that means. It's about measuring the organization, measuring cross-functionally, and then having the analytics, having the reporting capabilities, having the right structure that drives that behavior. And that's one of the things I found working in industry, as a CIO, in the business, and as a consultant now.
One of the things I imagine you ought to do is align the incentives of those various departments. They all have to be working toward the same thing. If sales and marketing, all they care about is making that last quarter, and all manufacturing cares about is optimizing their machines, those two things might not be the same in terms of serving the customer's needs. So I guess that's an important thing up front.
Absolutely, and that's where we go back to the original point around how do you move from the small company that was very cross-functional, because a lot of times those people were managing the whole function, to now breaking those things into silos. And so that's where you get into a challenge where you have critical mass, where you now have to start functionally breaking it up, but at the same time have a light process that help enables that cross-functional capability. In the beginning, you don't need systems for that because you're the only small group of people. You can do it through emails, you can do it through those things. Eventually, you need to have a good system where it fosters that level of communication, but through a light system that can do it, and through a system that is able to grow with you. And what I mean by system, I'm not talking a technology, I'm talking about a balance of a process, as well as the software, and as well as the structure that enables that communication.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about actual systems for a moment. The challenge of, let's say, an ERP being part of an organization. How does that frustrate or foster collaboration within a company? What are the pitfalls that you have to avoid there?
So when I worked as a CIO a couple years ago, my CEO always told me, why is it that every time we implement in a new location or a new acquisition, we have to write off all this inventory? And it's very clear. ERP systems, the good ones, help to really shed to light the things that are the skeletons, the things that people don't want to share. So that's the first piece. But there's a culture shock. Great example, led a large ERP implementation. Everybody was growing very quickly, had their own regions, and then all of a sudden there seemed to be this move to have tighter control at a corporate level. So that's the big challenge, is how do you get that ability to see things cross-functionally, at the same time give them the flexibility to be able to do things. That takes time. People are typically focused on what's important to them, and as you move up within the executive ladder, you need to be able to start seeing that information, and that's going to be an evolution, not a revolution.
When you were the CIO, were you the sheriff? Did you decide what got purchased and what got implemented, or did the line of business have input, and how did you deal with that?
Well, in the beginning, everybody wants everything, because when you go to the board, you have one strike, you go after it all. And then all of a sudden they realize, I want everything, but can I consume it? Does the business have the appetite to be able to do the things that's required to make that change? So what we built was a very good structure where we provided them the recommendations, but then they had to be the ones that owned it and managed it, as well as us as being a support. And that was a transition in the beginning. I'll be honest with you, that was a lesson learned for us, is we were a very innovative group. We were wanting to push the business. A lot of the people that came out of the IT group that I brought in had a lot of past experience and knew how to do it, but you have to do it in sync with what the business can handle and can consume. You have to be patient, and you have to make sure that you don't implement faster than what the business can handle and manage.
Now, meetings can be the death of a business. We all know
Absolutely.
that. But how important is it you bring together all these disciplines in face-to-face meetings on a regular basis so that they can get that sense of all being part of a common organization with a common purpose?
Very difficult. I know most companies have twice a year types of meetings. I think one of the things we've begun to do is really focus on having more concise meetings where the information coming out is helping to foster that cross communication throughout the month, so that when you come together, you're confirming instead of having to pull everything out because nobody's communicating. So the key is you have to have a communication vehicle, a solution, a system, a capability that helps enable visual viewing of all the information cross-functionally as part of your daily job. So you don't have to use meetings as a way to communicate. You have that ability to see cross-functionally. So if you have a good software, if you have a good light capability that you can see where you fit and what impacts you have within it, it's a little bit of a fishbowl effect. Because if everybody can see where there are the issues across the board and it's very transparent, that person is going to see it very quickly and they're going to need to manage it. And so I think that helps.
I want to get back just briefly to the role of the entrepreneur in a maturing company and the battle of corporate bloat, which tends to frustrate the entrepreneur, and slow down a company's ability to respond to new market changes, to new products and the like. Meanwhile, the entrepreneur is just wasting away down there and probably is going to leave the company at some point. So some tips for how to continue to foster that entrepreneurial spark that started the company, even as by necessity the company has grown. We've talked about some of this already in this conversation, but just give us some takeaways.
You have to have a good CEO, a strong COO who can balance the two forces. You've got sales that are typically people that are out there wanting to close the deals. They're the engine around growth. And then you have the operations group. You have to have a very equally weighted approach where you're not having it all one way or the other. The other thing is about education. You have to help that entrepreneurial person understand why these processes are in place and what's the reason for them. And conversely, you have to have the operations people say, you're not going to get everything perfect. That's part of what happens you can't be perfect on a demand plan. You can't be perfect when you're providing a forecast. And so you have to manage within the unknowns. Good operations people want all the information so they can do as much as they can to make it optimize. The other side is saying, just give me everything so I can just sell it and never make the customer upset. But you have to have that cross communication. You have to have a strong leader that can help create that balance.
Some great tips on how a company can remain entrepreneurial and agile even as they grow. Thank you so much, Alex, for your time.
Thank you for having me.
I've been speaking with Alex Pierroutsakos of Stellium. Thank you very much for watching.